Hello everyone, this is Geraths. This is the first of a two-part video about how to break down and understand how to combine compositional elements with value and texture. Here's my reference for this video. I will bring this up from time to time in the demo. It's a ranch in Utah soon after a winter snowstorm. It is important to compare what the location in the photo looks like as opposed to the changes I will make to create a final drawing with a clear and more dynamic composition. So my first objective is roughing out and blocking in the terrain. I know that the structures will be the focal points, but I need to understand the landscape and how it fits together in the compositional format and how all the shapes fit together to unify the sense of place. The main idea is to contrast the large blocks of shapes against the thinner directional areas and open up some of the larger pieces of the landscape. The thinner dagger-like shapes push the eye into more overlapping depths of field and space. Here's a simple little diagram to outline that idea. The blocks in the foreground will eventually be bushes. The main concept will be how to keep the eye moving around the scene. I'm now starting to block out the buildings and surrounding area. As you may notice in the diagram, in the corner, I think of that area more as shape design and sharp edges rather than barns and a shed. I certainly want to get the perspective right, but I also know that this will be blocked in with value later, so getting the structure and the building scale in the scene are my focus at this point. At this point, I think it's important to remind you that this is a step-by-step process and is more constructed and more illustrative than a spontaneous fly-by-the-seat-of-my-pants plein air drawing, though there are certainly the techniques that I use to get a final composition. I'm trying to keep the brain focused on positive and negative shapes here, as well as designing a picture with larger shapes that your head can get wrapped around when you have to start populating the composition with smaller objects and details. Now you will see we are moving on to more complex secondary elements to move the eye around the drawing, with graphic shapes and graphic edges starting to define bushes in the grass. These organic forms will eventually contrast the structures and angles of the buildings in the future. You might notice as I'm blocking this out that I'm using large, medium, and small shapes to move the eye from the foreground of the lower right to the middle ground and into the background and on the left-hand side of the composition. I want to be able to move the eye from smaller to larger forms, from straight edges to jagged edges as it moves up, like I said, up through that area up there. And the idea behind that is to make the eye see the rhythm and feel somewhat comfortable, but at the same time get challenged as it moves from one form to another, making the composition much more dynamic and fluid. I'm drawing through the forms in the barn into the smaller areas in the background, just again so I have the continuity of the hills in the background going in back of the barn and not changing shape, so the viewer will be able to not be sort of thrown off guard as I'm drawing from one thing to the other. So there's a continuity between all of these objects. So then I have that large barn played off against the smaller tractors and the hay bales in the back. Then I'm moving over to the mountains way in the background, again playing up where the little notches and where the ridges are to get the overlaps there. So now I'm going to jump on the bushes in the foreground. You can see I'm starting to put a lot more jagged edges and textures in the sense of the individual branches. Again, this is to bring the eye into the foreground. And I must admit that it is a lot more detailed than I usually make a diagram or a drawing at this point, especially if I'm going to be painting or drawing over the top of it. But I want you to see that the rhythm of the strokes, how hopefully it moves your eye in a flowing pattern over the elements from one thing to another and then all the way into the background. So as the whole composition comes together, I really do sort of bide my time and see what kind of elements are needed at particular times in the composition. And at this point, I'm going for the tree line in the back. You might notice from looking at the photographic comparison that I'm really taking the shapes of the trees and making them much more dynamic and simple, almost making them like little cutouts of the originals, and not really replicating one from the other, but making the eye move in a rhythmic pattern to help it sort of shift across the background from one edge of the paper to the other. Now, as I move into these ridge lines on the mountains in the background, I'm making sure that all the shapes and all the lines I put in do not interfere with the basic bigger picture of those mountains leading from one edge of the composition to the other. And eventually, every one of those lines will become a line of trees or values or shadows that will move your eye down into the forest or overlap the background and ultimately help sort of define the space and the depth of the composition. Now comes the part in the drawing where I'm going to put a little bit more of the sort of chunky, juicy little details in, like those vertical trees, the swirl pattern on the snow in the front, the telephone poles in it. Again, the telephone poles in there just to pull in more of a verticality in with the horizontal part of the drawing. The trees in the foreground are a little bit darker, so they add a little bit more punch. The swirling pattern of the snow where the cattle are going to be, and even the smaller sort of character tree in the background that'll bring your eye next to the barn. And here's a little diagram to promote sort of where the my idea where the overlaps from the major to minor areas are. So once again, I do think it's important to bring up the idea that this drawing is much more detailed and has a lot more information than I usually put into a breakdown drawing, getting ready to do a painting or, say, a marker drawing over the top of it. But I also think it's important that you see the process, that when I do start to put texture into something, you can see the rhythmic line and marks that I put in to get your eye to help flow around the composition. Hopefully you'll see the compare and contrasting of information and textures and forms as I move on to this next demonstrational drawing. So in this new drawing, I'm taking all the techniques and ideas that I showed in the last drawing, and though it may look similar, I'm simplifying it a lot, and then I'll be going over the top of it with marker, ink pens, ballpoint pens, fountain pens, and even a little bit of typewriter whiteout. One of the most important points of this part of the demo is that I'm really going to be trying to approximate field sketch ideas and techniques, and really show you how I put it together when I'm sitting in front of the real site in the real conditions that I'll be trying to replicate here. You may notice that I'm not exactly copying what I did in the last part of the demo. And like I'm taking on the trees a lot quicker here than I did before, not dealing so much with shape design, but those techniques are in my head as I'm doing it, and you'll see a similarity between it. But as usual, you are taking these concepts and moving them around depending on where your eye goes or where you want the eye to go and the materials you're going to be using. Also, I want to keep this design somewhat simple because it's not a coloring book. I'm not just going to make the line drawing and fill it in. I may choose to move some things around, add some other elements, accent some other points of it that perhaps I did not do in the last drawing. Here comes a point where I start to paint with this light French gray marker, so more on the warm side. And you'll see why in a little while. I basically want to get the warmth of the wood of the barn and of the brush in the front. But you'll see that even though some of these elements are going to be almost black by the time I finish it, I'm using this gray as sort of a unifying form, or the idea of filling in the shapes and getting that rhythm, moving from one part of the composition to the other, and just blocking out the main simple elements so I can get an idea of where to go with this, rather than, like I said before, rather than just trying to match the value, I'm going to build it up a little bit more with different techniques. Now, of course, I've sped up my drawing time by about 3 times the amount of speed that it's really being done at. But one thing you may notice is that a lot of times I use the marker almost like a paintbrush, and then really fill in the forms. That's the stuff that's a little bit more solid. Yet say here when I'm doing the brush, I leave a lot more space in between the marks. Again, you can notice in the photograph that there's snow in the background or ground there. I don't necessarily want to make those forms too solid. I want to get that air in there that, again, I'll use it as a backdrop to put more texture over the top of later. Another technique I'm using here is, instead of just coloring up and down or vertical or horizontal, is that a lot of times I am making the marker go in the direction of the landform or the structure form. Vertical on the side of the buildings, horizontal on the ground plane, sometimes diagonally. Again, that's to get your eye to move around over the top of it. So hopefully in the later parts of it, it'll give the idea of the direction that the form is moving in. Right now, as I move into the mountain ridges here, you'll notice that I'm leaving a lot more white of the paper than actually is from the photograph. And the reason for that is I'm beginning to think of the future of it, because I'll be putting the texture of the trees and the ridges over the top of this. And if I fill it in too much, I'm going to lose that sort of transparency or background or texture of the actual snow underneath the trees before I put them in and suggest the forms that are there. I'm not using a different marker on this, a darker marker. What I'm doing is I'm just layering over the same tone twice, and then it builds up a darker form over the top of that. Again, I'm using a warmer marker on the barns because I'll be putting a cool over the top of it, giving the idea of reflected light. Drawing really quickly, getting the texture in there, and then I'll be laying a cool sense of ink marker over the top of that in the future. The piece of equipment I picked up now is a water pen, and I put my own solution of ink on the inside of it. Again, a cool ink, and now you can see that effect where the shadow is going over the top of the warmer, say plant life or wood that's underneath it, so it sort of shines through. At the same time, being able to get the idea of the shadow shape and the combining of the warmth of that material along with the time of the day and the lighting conditions that are there. These bluer marks float over the top of the marker that's underneath it, and frequently you'll see that I'm using like long curving lines and short dashes, and like when I move into the tree line in the back, it'll go like slash, little marks, dots. And what I'm doing is I'm basically laying in the trunks of the trees back there that I'll fill in with line a little bit later, but it gives a good sense of that ridge back there and the ravine that the water flows through that you can't see. Now, a lot of times I'd like to tell you this is all planned, but a lot of times it's not. And I picked up this water pen that had more of a purplish blue solution in it, very diluted of course, and I'm going for the ridges in the back, again to sort of like show the topography is a little bit different. It gives a slightly little different sort of texturing to it, and then moving up to some foreground elements using now a slightly different blue on top of that. Now I'm going to pull up that diagram that I used previously to show you where that idea of the shape design comes into the mark making that's on top of it and the values that I'm using. It's an organizing principle that even though as complex as it's going to get, I still go back to this diagram as what I'm sort of revolving everything around so the whole composition makes sense. doesn't dissolve into a bunch of useless little details. At this point, I'm going to start to suggest textures in the bushes, in the trees, right now on the side of the barn. You see I'm leaving a little bit more of a vertical pattern to suggest the boards that are in the barn. And now the brush, the sort of stickiness of it, and the individual pieces of sticks and different branches. Now making the side of that shed a lot more solid, and then moving into the front where the ambient light on the shed is showing a little bit more of the texture. After moving through the bottom of the forest in the background, I'm starting to add this sort of darker blue gray to it, and sort of promote more of the ridge lines, maybe the idea of the gullies and the ravines. Still leaving a lot of white out there because I know I'm going to be putting information over the top of that, but I want to make it a little bit more dense, like a thicker forest, so it sort of holds the background a little bit better. I don't even change materials, but now I move on to the brush in the foreground, and this darker marker that I'm using here, smaller one of course, is that it's now suggesting the shadow pattern on the inside of the bottom of the brush, since the light's coming from the background and raking over the top of it, creating more of a contrast from where it's planted, and also the grass humps that are in the front and the way that those kind of form together as well. I'm trying to build up a rhythm of marks so your eye will move across the composition better. Up to this point, you'll notice I haven't put a lot of real darks in it. I'm starting to do that. I've got a little bit more confidence that my mid-range values in the composition are working and the flow's working well enough. So now I'm going to bump up and accent some of the more shadowed areas, contrasting up against the white of the snow, and now starting to put in a little bit more ground cover terrain where the cattle will be resting eventually, and then jumping into some of the shadowed areas and then building those up a little bit more. Basically trying to put the composition together and get the lighting right, and then again reinvigorate the shape design and move the rhythm of the darks and the lights together so they work in concert. So just a little visual hint on that. That may look like it's a black marker, but it's a 3/4, 75% cool gray marker instead. I don't really come in with the darks until right at the end to suggest texture and sort of an absolute shadow on some areas. I don't want to make it look too dead and too high contrast too quickly. I'm bringing in a Pentel brush pen at this point, and again, once it may look black, but it's a really thick 3/4 gray. And then what I'm doing is confident enough now where I'm starting to put some more of the architectural stuff in, a little bit more of the texture of the bushes, the individual branches, but trying to build up a rhythm across it and not get too oriented into the details. You might know even I'm suggesting a lot of the ends of the twigs and bushes rather than really illustrating them in, because again, I want your eye to pass through that information rather than focusing and getting stuck on it. Same thing with these ideas of the fence post that I'm putting back here. I'm not making them sort of regimented. I'm putting a little bit more of that hand-built irregularities into it as I put it together, and then anchoring in the corner of the barn, a little bit more suggestion brush. There's the cast shadows coming off the roof onto the side of the barn, and then now I'm doing corrals in the back. So you can see I'm moving on from one kind of element to the other using the same mark making material in this marker that I switched over to. I'm getting to this part of drawing, there comes that battle in between texture and detail and keeping the whole composition together. So I have to make some really big editing choices about what and how much I do want to put into a drawing, how much I want to suggest, and how much I really want to get in there and nail what the actual details are. Again, to give identification on some areas, but then just hinting at other areas to keep the composition fresh. As I move into doing the mountains and the forests up here, I do a heck of a lot of editing in this and simplification. And you'll notice as I use the black brush pen here, sometimes the pen moves really fast. I get a lot of that kind of dry brushing effect that shows the paper and the marker through it, where other times I'll come in and suggest trees, using the brown and blue areas underneath it to suggest different levels of the forest, and then just articulating one or two in a rhythmic pattern so your eye flows from one of those marks to the other, knowing that it's representing a forest and a group of trees rather than cliche little individual trees. It's not a bunch of random marks, but I'm definitely making sure that I pick up a rhythm and a harmony to move your eye from short to thick, from large, medium, and small, using lines sometimes to suggest a ridge line or a group of trees, sometimes even making a schmatter of marks on top to give the idea of a more disorganized group of foliage in there. Now I come back into this tree line, and you can see why I left the background white. Just like the snow back there, to be able to silhouette these threadbare trees here, just with the branches and the trunks, and again, not going crazy with it so it ends up looking like grass, but actually formatting and really showing off that winter skeleton of the trees as I put it together. Taking suggestions about what the shape looks like and how the tree actually grows, but bending it and designing it so it makes use of what I want it to do. I'll probably come over the top of this, I think, with some black other lines over the top of this, but this gives a good rhythmic pattern to make the eye move through the composition horizontally. So now I want to bring your eye to something I like. I like painting fence posts. And so I'm going to pick up, as you can see from the photograph, that horizontal rhythm of the in-between of the slats of the wood. But again, not doing it in a flat rhythmic pattern, but make it interesting as the eye moves across. So as the camera moves back, you'll be able to see how that little detail that I like fits into the whole composition. You have these smaller marks that contrast the big one of the barn and the big white areas to each side of it. And there'll be more details like shadows and textures and more fence posts coming in the future. Now it's somewhat surprising, but you can have small elements like telephone poles, fence posts, footprints in snow, in sand, even like little branches move your eye. If you're putting like dark lines against white backgrounds, or even whitening over the top of darker areas, creates like little textural patterns and little pathways that the eye will follow and be able to march you through a composition without getting stuck too much in one place. Note that these little shadows I do off the fence posts aren't random, but they really do keep with the idea of the terrain and the direction that the sun is hitting that fence. So again, it's not random. It really helps with the idea of the landscape that you're painting. That also happens to work when you're drawing things like the top of sheds, not necessarily ground forms, but building forms. So as you might notice here as I paint this or draw this with this brush pen, I do these little ghost things where I'll actually kind of fake out drawing it at first and just kind of run the pen over the top to kind of guess what the effect will be, and then hitting the dry brush quickly over the top of it, so it'll give more of a pattern of sort of corroded metal that it is on. And then I'll come back over the top of that later with the darker lines that will show the striations between the different pieces of tin on the roof. As I draw with that brush pen going from thin to thick line, you'll notice I'll go from that striation from metal to the edge of the wood on the front of the shed and into the brush on the right hand side of that with different kind of marks and different kind of hints of the forms that I'm looking at. Notice again the previous marker is just a backdrop that I'm going to put the texture over the top of it to format and kind of bring out a little bit more. As I might have mentioned before, sometimes I'll draw knowing that I'm going to do another technique over the top of it and don't rush it because that's just part of the process. So now I'm using a white colored pencil to give more of the idea, as you can see from the photograph, the dry brush over the top of it, that lighter brush, and then coming over the top of it with a piece of charcoal pencil in block form, and then kind of making it a little bit more dense so again it pops more into the foreground. Now I'm using a fountain pen, cheap fountain pen that is, to be able to come in here and draw those individual slats so I can kind of get the vertical and horizontal, and then it'll go back to the background there and actually give the idea that there's a hole in that fence as I march across to the back part of the fence, and then put a little bit more detail and hints that the light is hitting that part of the fence way back there in the background there. By the way, those little white dots in front of the fence that weren't there previously is a from typewriter whiteout that covers just about everything. And so then I can go over the top of that, maybe even suggest that there's some snow peeking through the fence posts and between the shadow lines. Then I'll come back over the top here with this fountain pen and kind of fill in the ground plane and the top of the fence posts a little bit more so you know where they are in space. Later on in the drawing here, you can see the method to my madness. So I'm simplifying those doors there, and you can see that those cool pins, markers over the top of the worm underneath it, and then coming in and simplifying, say, the cast shadow coming off the edge of the roof, and a few little board patterns there, not stopping so much to illustrate rather than just kind of describe and hint at. If I go in and try to describe all those boards in that side of that barn, I'm just going to kill the atmospheric perspective in it, and it won't drop into the background as much as it needs to, and just hint at what the materials are. Now, it may not be super obvious at this point, but notice perhaps I'll use that mid-tone gray, and when I put the lines in for the telephone poles and the trees, you'll see I use that to sort of suggest the fact that the sun is coming from the background and shining onto the telephone poles, but still giving a little bit of rim light and grays to the fence posts and to the bushes and to the fence in the background. Oh, and this is to show you how you can cover over your screw-ups and change them. This is a typewriter whiteout pen. You can see I'm kind of putting it down and then using the tips of my fingers to kind of smear it around a little bit. So perhaps it looks like that snow is kind of sitting over the top of where the cattle have gone through and sort of pushed through it. And then I'll come back in and kind of hit the shadows on a little bit more. gives it more kind of a rougher look to it. Again, find all sorts of different materials that work for you and carry them along with you. There's all sorts of ways to be able to fix your mistakes, if you even want to call them mistakes, or accent different parts of the drawing that you need to. So by the way, I screwed up the roof of that barn there, and I went over with a typewriter whiteout to suggest that that side of the roof is facing the sun. And now what I'm doing is I'm going with little teeny tiny marks, not overdoing the background, because I just want to hint at a lot of stuff, suggesting and sort of acknowledging that there's objects in the background, but not identifying them so much. I'm at the point now where I want to really start to acknowledge the foreground, which means that I'm going to pull up the textures, and you can see from all that mess of twisted grass and pieces of snow on the ground and thorny bushes that I have to do a lot of editing, and I have to do a lot of combinations of things, not even suggesting that it's grass or bushes or whatever it is, but again, more it's got a unique kind of texture. So you see I'll go from sort of darker lines and thinner ones at the top, and then all of a sudden now just kind of blasting in these like little disconnected lines, using what I've already got there as sort of a backdrop or almost like an underpainting to put this on the top of, again, to anchor your eye into the foreground, but still not lose that idea of the snow on the ground that I just definitely do want to acknowledge and really sort of format it and bring it more towards the forefront, because that's what the main part of the drawing's about. I'm going to circle around to one of the important aspects of the beginning of this video, is the fact that no matter how much of this detail and information I put in here and all these little textures, I'm not losing the shape of the bushes and the ground plane, and trying to make it look interesting and varied, not boring and repetitious. If I lose those shapes, I lose the idea of what all of these details are attached to, even when I'm putting this little whitening in here, again, to sort of bring more of a different kind of texture over the top of it that the viewer will read through. And so what you can see is like a little squiggle, and sometimes it's individual lines. Same idea goes for when I lay the cattle in. It's not to illustrate the cattle or even describe that they are cattle. It's just they're animals. You can kind of see that the quadrupeds, there's heads there. They're in different directions. Some are sideways, some are facing you. Sometimes they're very obvious. I usually do one or two of the animals or something recognizable, and then just use a lot of repetition sometimes. And again, it's more of a compositional element to move your eye through the drawing and into the background, as you can see back there. Just enough where I'll plant the little legs on them every now and then, just so you can kind of see like, oh, okay, that is cattle way there in the background, but you don't need to know exactly what they are. So after adding that last little important piece of information of the cattle on this ranch, we're going to pull back and look at the whole composition and the reference that it came from. And then you can see the edits and the changes that I made in relationship to trying to tell the story of this little place in Glendale, Utah. So perhaps in the future you can pause this and take a look at this in relationship to the drawing that was made out of it, and see the fact of how much simplification and re-editing to move your eye around the composition that there is. Remember, there'll be a part 2 to this video and demonstration that will come after this. I'm throwing in a few of my plein air urban sketching sketches for you to take a look at, so you can see the different materials at the end game of where I'm actually going out and drawing plein air on scene. The different lighting, different weather, times of the day. It can even be laid out in simple lines such as these. But all these techniques hold true, and hopefully they'll help you in the future. And feel free to share this video and go to the other ones that are here. Definitely like the video and comment, and there'll be more coming on the way. And so I thank you very much for watching it, and please visit again. Adios, folks. See you later. Bye.